I mean, slavery by law is abolished.
Okay. Now, so come back to the question of novel. Who wrote novel first? Who?
Who wrote it? Men wrote.
Men wrote. Who did they write about?
About subjects that interested them.
Subjects that interested them. Okay. Who read the novels early? Early people who read
Obviously
novels?
men.
Initially men. only.
Initially men. Why is that novel is associated with women?
Education.
Education?
Most novels, whether it is Indian or it is Western, the main focus is on women.
The main focus is on
women. You take right from, I mean, we're not talking about
Robinson
Robinson
Crusoe.
Crusoe, but if you just leave that alone, whether it's Pamela, it is Clarissa,
Or even Maud Flanders.
Maud Flanders, whether it
So
is.
the subject is written by men. The subject is women. Mostly.
Who is objectified?
Yes.
It's a fact. It's a
Glorified.
fact.
Yes.
Who is
Latter.
objectified, not
So the
just glorified.
new has a lot of these in it. Of course, it's a new form. I mean, novel, modern. Now, when you talk about question of modern, again, what is modernity? How do you define modernity?
A shift from conventions,
Shift from conventions, okay.
progress,
From
progress.
progress.
Progressive.
Something latest and contemporary.
Latest, contemporary, okay.
So
Those are more or less synonyms of
Passion.
modern.
Supposed to have been influenced by scientific
Scientific temperament.
temperament. But a curious mixture of emotion and scientific temperament.
Also associated with more freedom.
Freedom.
More freedom when compared to the non-modern.
Now, it is associated with scientific temperament. It's also fictional. So you're combining a fictional element, but you say that it has scientific temperament.
Yeah, fiction that's tempered with scientific temperament.
Now, one of the ways in which one could define a novel is it could be any of these. That is, it is such a loose form that if you're writing a novel, it could be about anything. Whereas if you were writing a tragedy, you had to
Follow certain norms.
follow certain norms. You had to write about a
Person of noble
high
Hamartia,
personality,
catharsis.
of noble
What Aristotle
lineage,
said.
all of those, right? So if you were writing an epic, you had to write grand themes. Like that, for each of the literary genres that we were generally used to hearing about, there have been certain literary conventions. Now, so at some point, people must have thought we must have a form which is
Free from all these.
free from all of these conventions, restrictions, etc. And at the point at which the novel started, it was also something that was invented for the sake of a leisurely people who have had the time. Now, very interestingly, women had the time. Women had the time in spite of the fact that they were all the time busy taking care of children, taking care of home. Still, they also had time to read. They found time to read.
They were women of the leisure class. They were women who belonged to a certain class of society who could read,
Yeah.
who had the time to read.
Not all women.
Yeah, therefore the major reading. But I think also through that developed the what you call serialized novel,
Yes.
because people didn't find time to read so much, so you had the
So
serialized.
you had the
novel.
serial.
Like Dickens's things were mostly
All-
serialized.
Yeah. It gave the freedom to the writer, the time also for the writer to write a 1 week's time or whatever it is, but it also gave people the time to sit, read, and wait for the next installment, right? Now, think about all of these as baggage that you bring when you talk about the question of. Now, going back to the question of modernity, is colonial modernity, this is one of the pet terms that we hear. Is colonial modernity any different from modernity in general?
Yes.
What did colonial modernity mean?
Colonial modernity, especially in a country, colonized countries, it brought with it the English language.
Okay, but colonial is not limited only to English.
Okay,
right?
probably the earlier colonies like the Dutch, the Portuguese,
Yeah.
they all brought with them the Western ethos, the Western culture, and its interface with India, the nation, the culture, the ethos.
So when the moment colonial is added to modernity, you have something that you associate with Western modernity. Now, whether it is Portuguese who came here, whether it is French, whether it is a Dutch, or whether it is the British, or if these people had gone to other countries like Africa, wherever people went, they have also taken their language to these countries that they have colonized, impose their language, impose their culture, impose their traditions, etc. So when we talk about colonial modernity in any context, whether it is in the Indian context or in an African context or wherever you are talking about a mixture of traditions which are brought from outside and almost forced on the colonized. In the context of India, it was majorly done by the British because they were able to successfully send away the rest of the colonizers.
Earlier colonizers.
Right? Where Kadambari tradition is the Bana was the originator of this tradition of Kadambari, which is a kind of a chain of stories. So you put together stories one after the other and then write a longer literary piece in Sanskrit. This is a Sanskrit tradition. That is supposed to be one of the originators of Indian tradition of the novel. The closest to that would be John Quicksilver. Also a series of. Now, the moment colonial modernity enters into the Indian context, we have a clash between Western ideas of modernity, Western ideas of writing the novel, and Indian ways of writing the novel. So, when today we talk about early Indian novels, we can no longer talk about early Indian novels as just Indian per se. It's a kind of a, again, what it meant for Western ideas of progress, which also includes the term scientific temper that Uma mentioned. Realism. Plus the fictional element. The element of fantasy. Now, how do you merge in a genre two contradictory ways of talking about realism, at the same time talking about the fantastic? So the birth of the novel is in some sense a coming together of these two contradictory impulses of both the realistic as well as the fantastic. Raja Ram Mohan. And what was the institution that
Brahma Samaj.
Brahma Samaj. What did Brahma Samaj do?
It promoted education of the girls.
Education.
Abolition of Sati Sahagamanam.
Yeah.
Education of the girls. Yes.
Abolition of Sati Sahagamanam.
Abolition of sati.
Widow remarriages and prevention of childhood marriages.
Brahma Samaj was interested in. Now, one of the ways in which Brahma Samaj has cleverly done this is also to modernize Indian ways of thinking to suit the Western ways of looking at things. So it's a very clever way in which you can talk about Indian conditions, you can talk about, in fact he was also supposed to have reread the Vedas. He was, so one of the ways in which, so one way is to accept modernity as it comes to you from the West, but at the same time, to keep that in check, you try to reform your own religion, your own ways of thinking. In which case, you can put the westernizing agenda also in check. So it was, they were trying to balance these two things.
Tradition and modern.
Tradition and modernity. So how do you balance tradition and modern? Now the political reform is the birth of the idea of the nation. For people who started the Congress as it started at that time, political reform, the independence of the nation, was much more important than the social reform. Jyotibai Phule, Savitribai Phule, and later Ambedkar, they disagree with this thing about political reform. So quickly from social reform of the early Brahma Samaj kind of reform to the mid 19th and late 19th century to the early 20th centuries, the move was to become politically independent, politically modern, etc., and keep the social reform at bay. they were not very much interested in looking at the societal, woman was there. Educating women, child marriage, widow remarriages, they were there. But all those things were confined to the upper caste women. There were issues concerning only with the upper caste women. Those issues did not concern the lower class women at all. So in a certain sense, they were talking about social reform, which was confined to a very, very microscopic minority of upper echelons of Indian society. Whereas Savitribai Phule, Jyotibai Phule, later Ambedkar, they said it is not these that is important to us. What is important is the social reform. In fact, Ambedkar's disagreement with Gandhi was on this whole question of whether political reform should precede social reform or social reform should precede political reform. If we became independent, free from the British rule, and still socially we continue to be in the same state, we have oppression of all kinds in society, then what kind of independence have we really achieved? Now, novel in India enters into this picture. It is here that the novel does a lot of tricks. 1857.
Mutiny Sipai.
What's the importance of 1850? What is the other name that is?
First War of Indian Independence.
Now, 1857 is also significant in Indian history of the Indian novel, because Yamuna Paryatan, the first Marathi novel. This was written in 1857. Now this talks about the widow remarriages. It talks about child marriages, etc. as early as 1857. Now it also talks about the role of education, the role of Christianity, the role of education for women. Now, if you want society to progress, if you want social reform to happen, if you want women to be free from child marriages and they should be ready for remarriages, what is to happen is for them to be educated. It was one of those earliest novels which had a positive attitude towards education of girls. So there are several people who talked about social reform, who also talked about widow remarriage, abolition of child marriages. But all of them did not uniformly talk also about the need to educate women. It's only when you educate women, so the reform must come from within. Now, one of the earliest novels that we have is the This is written by an Indian to address the question of caste. Now, by that time, by the time he is writing, the British have been well entrenched. You are already talking about 1857. Our attack, our trying to ask for the first signs of our asking for independence, etc. You are talking about 10 years, 1857, 1866. You are talking about 9 years time. Now, why is it that a Portuguese novel was able to talk about the question of caste when the British people were not talking about it. Now, other way of looking at it is precisely because British people were not addressing the question of caste, it is their rivals, the Portuguese. And I mean, in Portuguese, a Goan, this man, Francisco Luis Gomes, he was a member of the Portuguese Parliament. He represented Goa in the Portuguese Parliament. He is the man who is writing about it. So, in a certain sense, the other colonizer is telling the British that you talk about modernity, you talk about the questions of progress, you talk about Western ideas of progress, etc. But what are you talking about? Why are you not addressing the question of caste? Right? So this novel becomes important precisely because it addresses a problem which neither the Indian elite, the upper caste, who were writing about various issues. Now, Raja Ram Mohan Roy and all the other people who, along with him, then the Prarthana Samaj, all the other movements, they simply talked about social reform at a very superficial level. They did not address the question of caste, nor did the British who were ruling us. We needed somebody else to be doing this. Now, to me, this is an Indian novel. It's an Indian novel precisely because it addresses the questions that are relevant to the Indian context. And they are written by an Indian. Although it is written in Portuguese.
Yes.